Rules Committee come to order, and thank you very much for joining us as we ended our discussions where members brought members to the floor. We're now ready to proceed, and the gentleman from Georgia would be recognized for the purpose of making a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee provide for further consideration of H.R. 3219, the Make America Secure Appropriations Act of 2018, under a structured rule. The rule provides that no further general debate shall be in order. The rule provides that further amendment printed in Part A of Rules Committee report shall be considered as adopted. The rule makes in order only those further amendments printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report, amendments in block described in Section 3 of the resolution, and available pro forma amendments described in Section 4 of House Resolution 473. Each further amendment printed in Part B of the report may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, may be withdrawn by the proponent at any time before action thereon, shall not be subject to amendment except amendments described in Section 4 of House Resolution 473, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against further amendments printed in Part B of the report or against amendments en bloc described in Section 3 of the resolution. The rule provides that it shall be in order at any time for the chair of the Committee on Appropriations or his designee to offer further amendments en bloc consisting of amendments printed in Part B of the report not earlier disposed of. Amendments en bloc shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for 20 minutes, equally divided, and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Appropriations or their designees. Shall not be subject to amendment except amendments described in Section 4 of House Resolution 473, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. Finally, Section 5 of the rule provides that it shall be in order at any time on the legislative day of July 27th, 2017, for the Speaker to entertain motions that the House suspend the rules as though under Clause 1 of Rule 15, and that the Speaker or his designee shall consult with the minority leader or her designee on the designation of any matter for consideration pursuant to this section.
Thank the gentleman from, distinguished gentleman from Georgia for his recognition and motion that he's made. Is there a discussion or amendment to that, gentleman?
Yes, sir, we do have that, Mr.
Yes,
Chair.
yes.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. We were voted down last night when we tried to get an open rule for these bills, and then you voted us down again on the floor today. So we thought we'd try something a little different. And I hope you'll be with us on this one. We hope springs eternal. I move the committee grant the Rules Committee print of H.R. 3219, a modified open rule, making in order any amendment submitted to the Rules Committee so that all members who submitted amendments on the minibus have an opportunity to offer those amendments on the floor, not unlike what the Senate is doing now. I ask for a yes vote.
Okay. Any discussion with that?
Not more than I've made. Does anybody else want to comment? All right.
Okay. Discussion by the members? No discussion? All right. The vote will be on slaughter amendment. Those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
No. Roll call, please.
Noes have it, noes have it. And gentlewoman asks for roll call. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole. Mr. Woodall. No. Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Collins. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Byrne, no. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse, no. Mr. Buck. Ms. Cheney. Ms. Cheney, no. Ms. Slaughter.
Aye.
Ms. Slaughter, aye. Mr. McGovern. Aye. Mr. McGovern, aye. Mr. Hastings. Aye. Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Polis.
Aye.
Mr. Polis, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk will report the total.
4 yeas, 6 nays.
The motion, the amendment is not agreed to. Not agreed to. Further amendment or discussion?
Yes, please.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Chairman, I see that Mrs. Roybal Allard's amendment to prohibit funding for the border wall was blocked from even being considered by the House. But you are proposing that we self-execute Mr. Carter's amendment into the bill, even though it breaks the budget rules. That means, because you are self-executing it, requiring no vote and not giving her one, that members won't have an opportunity to debate or vote on the president's expensive and ill-conceived border wall. So, Mr. Chairman, I've got an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order, give the necessary waivers for the amendment by Representative Roy Ball Allard to Division E of H.R. 3219, number 1, which would prohibit the use of funds for border wall consideration. And I do have some points I'd like to make. First, the politics and the cost. The wall is not about immigration. If the majority were serious about securing the border, they would take up a comprehensive immigration reform bill, and as you know, there would be a lot of support on our side of the aisle. But the Carter Amendment is really about scoring a political win for an administration that is already veering badly off course. This so-called win will cost taxpayers $1.6 billion now, on the way to totaling more than $21 billion if the entire wall is built. President Trump has promised Mexico would pay for the border wall, literally, since day one of his campaign, although very few of us ever believed that. In his 2015 announcement speech, he said, quote, "I will build a great wall on the southern border, and I will make Mexico pay for that wall, mark my words," end quote. And just this month, even after meeting with the president of Mexico, he said that he absolutely still expects Mexico to pay for the wall, but here we are, spending $1.6 billion of taxpayer money on the same wall without nary a peso for Mexico. Now, only in Washington would something like this be considered a victory. Let's talk about the true cost of this amendment. The public stands to lose mightily if their hard-earned tax dollars go toward such an embarrassing and wasteful boondoggle. Let me put it in perspective. $21 billion could be used to double the federal investment, double it in public schools. It could provide 6 million people with health care under Medicaid. It would buy school lunches for tens of millions of low-income children. But these investments clearly are not a priority for Republicans or President Trump. President Trump's own budget director famously said, and please listen to this because when I saw it today, I really couldn't believe it. The budget director famously said that it isn't worth feeding hungry children if the nutrition does not improve their school performance, and that Meals on Wheels sounds great, but it doesn't work. Now, that takes care of the elderly and the children, and so that only the thriving middle class and people in the middle age, not middle age, but all of us here, except for me, maybe Elsie. Would you say that right, Elsie? We're finished, Elsie. We don't produce enough. But I think they disagree. Now, FDR said, and this is a good one, quote, "The test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much. It is whether we provide enough for those who have too little," end quote. So let's talk about what this Congress and this administration and this committee have prioritized. Rolling back important protections that keep the air and water pure and clean, silencing scientists who are sounding the alarm on climate change, passing giveaways to big banks at the expense of consumers, attacking civil rights, including today the right for transgender Americans to serve their country. That was such a jolt and such a shock, and I think it's bringing back a whole sense of outrage. Now, Democrats aren't alone in calling this wall unnecessary. Representative Hurd, a former CIA officer, sits on the Homeland Security Committee and represents the largest border district in Texas. And he bravely testified here on Monday night against this wall. And he said, quote, "Having a one-size-fits-all solution to border security doesn't make sense," end quote. Now, immigration has enriched our nation from its very beginning. In fact, we are known as a nation of immigrants. This interconnectedness is why our country has shaped the rest of the world rather than feared it. The president's new communications director, Anthony Scaramucci, said it's best when he wrote online, quote, "Walls don't work, never have, never will," end quote. Apparently, the majority needs to relearn that lesson. After all, it was the Republican president, Ronald Reagan, who 30 years ago last month stood in West Berlin and demanded that another wall be torn down. Make no mistake, Mr. Chairman, if ever this wall is built, it too will be torn down. Not by immigrants crossing the border seeking freedom or any act by an outside adversary. It will come down because the American people understand, in a way that this president and many congressional Republicans do not, that you cannot barricade the United States away from the rest of the world. Mr. Scaramucci ended his comment about the president's wall by writing, and I quote, "Don't fall for it," end quote. Well, the congressional Republicans apparently have fallen for it because we astoundingly have this self-executed $1.6 billion of our hard-come-by money for the wall. But I have no doubt that the public won't, and they will hold you accountable for what you're doing here. This rule puts Mr. Carter's $1.6 billion border wall amendment into the bill without a vote by the full House. I am simply asking for a vote for Ranking Member Roy Ball Allard's amendment to block that funding. Every member of this House deserves an opportunity to cast their vote on this issue, which has been in the forefront since Donald Trump ran for office. And you are putting it in here with costing them $1.6 billion when they've been promised it would cost them nothing, and frankly, it's worth nothing, and not allowing them to speak on the floor through the representatives they send here to do that work for them. This is a historic moment. You may think for the better, I would say for the worse. It shouldn't happen here in the Rules Committee. None of you should not have the deciding factor for the 435 members who vote in this body whether or not to fund Trump's wall. Please give us a vote not to. I'm pretty sure you're afraid that if you allow a vote on this wall, that it will be defeated, and certainly I know that it should be. But whatever happens, that decision should happen on the floor of the House, not in this room. And I urge support of my amendment.
Ms. Slaughter, thank you very much. The gentlewoman is asking for a vote on the Roy Ball Allard amendment. Is there further discussion?
None.
We'll now vote on the motion, the amendment from the gentlewoman from New York. Those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
Roll call.
Noes have it, noes have it. The clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole? Mr. Woodall? No. Mr. Woodall? No. Mr. Burgess? No. Mr. Burgess? No. Mr. Collins? Mr. Byrne? No. Mr. Byrne? No. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Newhouse? No. Mr. Buck? Ms. Cheney? Ms. Cheney? No. Ms. Slaughter?
Aye.
Ms. Slaughter? Aye. Mr. McGovern?
Aye.
Mr. McGovern? Aye. Mr. Hastings?
Aye.
Mr. Hastings? Aye. Mr. Polis?
Aye.
Mr. Polis? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Clerk will report the total.
4 yeas, 6 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. Further amendment or discussion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
The judge is welcome to
Mr. Chairman,
present his views.
I have an amendment to the rule, and I move the committee strike the section of the rule which self-executes Representative Carter's amendment to Division E, number 2, and provides the $1.6 billion for the construction of President Trump's misguided border wall. And instead, make that amendment in order so we can have an up or down vote on the floor. Additionally, Mr. Chairman, if I can, I'll provide a brief discussion regarding same. I echo the sentiments of the ranking member, Ms. Slaughter, which I think poignantly highlight virtually the same situation that I'm bringing to the Rules Committee's attention. I don't support the Carter Amendment. In fact, I vigorously oppose it. However, I do believe that members deserve a chance to vote on it. Let me make it very clear, Mr. Chairman. I am pro-military and I am against the wall. The conundrum for some members is that they will be put in the position of having to, notwithstanding the fact that they're pro-military, vote against this particular measure because they're against the wall. Speaker Ryan himself described the self-executing process as, and let me quote him, legislative, and I'm quoting, legislative trickery to enact legislation that does not have majority backing, unquote. That's from the Speaker of the House in another iteration, who evidently is approving a measure that he himself described its process as legislative trickery. Politico called it a procedural maneuver designed to avoid a floor vote that might fail. Like Ms. Slaughter said, I too believe that if the Carter Amendment was put on the floor as I think it should be, I believe that it would fail. I believe that a border wall would fail. And let me make it very clear, long before Donald John Trump, there were members on this committee and in this body that did, in fact, favor a border wall. The distinction is Donald John Trump ran for president saying, and we knew at the time, at least those of us that are in the cognoscenti in this nation, we knew doggone well that Mexico wasn't going to pay for no wall. And it's not good to have someone lie like that, and that's what it boils down to when all is said and done. He lied. He knew, and the Mexican president on more than one occasion has made it very clear to him, at least during his lifetime, that was not going to happen. I'd like unanimous consent to insert the Politico article from today entitled, House Republicans Seek to Dodge Border Wall Vote. I'd ask unanimous consent to place this in the record, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this is downright undemocratic. Downright undemocratic. Let's have a vote and let this proposal succeed or hopefully fail on its merits. To do this legislative trickery continues a tremendous disservice that we're doing to the members of this body. I ask for support of this amendment, Mr. Chairman.
Discussion? Thank you very much, sir. Discussion? I would, gentleman's recognized.
Yeah, thank you. I thank you for the gentleman for yielding for the discussion. I again just want to highlight that who will pay for the wall was not just a campaign promise by the president. I'm going to enter for the record with unanimous consent, Mr. Chair, an article from the LA Times, July 7th, 2017, just a few weeks ago. President Trump reiterated that Mexico absolutely will pay for the wall just 2 weeks ago. So frankly, anybody who votes to spend our taxpayer money, $1.6 billion in the wall, is directly violating President Trump's not only campaign promise, but his policy. So spending American taxpayer money on the wall was never part of what President Trump ran on, nor is it part of what he supports today. And frankly, it's a direct violation of his campaign promise because he never talked about building a wall with American taxpayer funds. It was always linked together. Who will pay? He even would ask the crowds, Mexico. But and to say he has not moved on from that policy. People change their minds. Maybe you're elected president. That was a campaign. I understand. But this was just 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago. This is not candidate Donald Trump. This is President Donald Trump who said Mexico will absolutely pay. So I would just point out that if people are trying to appeal to Trump supporters, this does not succeed because this is the opposite of President Trump's policy. This is forcing American taxpayers to pay $1.6 billion for a wall. And I wanted to make sure everybody is crystal clear in that regard, that this completely undermines President Trump's campaign promise and what he said as recently as 2 weeks ago, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Further discussion? I would simply note that this is about 50 miles worth of fencing. It's not a wall, it is a fence. The men and women of the United States who protect our borders are being overrun by very dangerous people. They find themselves isolated where there's one or two of them and 50 or 100 of others who are unknown to them and who sometimes could be a drug cartel, sometimes could be something else. The Border Patrol, known as the Border Patrol, these officers that protect from ICE and Homeland Security encounter people on a daily basis. They are seeking myself and other members from Texas to be in support of this because they believe it will help not only the traffic, but their lives and their effectiveness of what they're doing. The actual wall that may be referred to, such as what was done by the Russians in East Germany, that is not what this is. This is a barrier. This is designed to help move properly and effectively not only water, but other animals that may come through. There are opportunities for law enforcement to effectively manage this, to gain control of the border, to put cameras up on
Mr.
it.
Chairman, when you finish, would you yield?
I will.
Okay.
And what I'm suggesting to you is, in no way is this that we are approving something designed that would be, in my opinion, anything like what is known as the Berlin Wall. It comes as a request, a longstanding request from way back in at least 2000 or 2001, when we recognized the threats against this country, notwithstanding, I'm not referring to human threats, I'm referring to threats from individuals who would bring contraband, dangerous items, for the clearly against the laws of this country. And we have seen from time to time where our men and women have been injured, shot at, taken advantage of, beaten up. And I consider this a normal and regular process. The president, I believe, is according us an opportunity to have through this a actual architectural viewpoint that the president would expect to come back, and we as policymakers then would have an idea about whatever, quote, the wall was going to look like. This actually is put in place for protection for the law enforcement community to effectively deal with them being completely overrun. And I think that if we're going to be honest about this, I would hope that you would want to come down next year with me or later. I would invite this committee to come down to the border and to see firsthand not only of the circumstances that our law enforcement is engaged in, but the needed and necessary choice to protect American people who live directly on the border, who've had hundreds of people running through their backyards, people robbing people, coming and I'm sure they need things, but the average citizens who are down there find themselves overrun and look to law enforcement, and this is that first, second, or third effort, knowing that we have done some things in the past. But I don't view this as that Berlin Wall that the president would be accused of. This is common sense opportunity And I would once again say, and I'm willing to do this, I would enjoy having my colleagues come down, and as we would if we were visiting NIH, or if we were visiting a military base, I would expect that we would know that we're dealing with men and women of law enforcement who've given up their careers and their lives, and they go out every night, and they go out every day, and they're asking for a chance not to be overrun. So that's the way I view this. If this were for $40 billion, if this were that big wall, I would have probably not handled it this way. That is not what this is for.
All right.
This is for $1.6 billion, and this is a real protection for the men and women of law enforcement. This
Mr. Chairman,
is
yield.
not, I will, this is not that wall. It's not what it is. And I want to thank you for hearing from me about a person who has lived on the border, a person who has friends that are on the border, a person who visits the border, including young men and young women who are there because we've asked them to be there. And I want to give it back straight to you. That is what I think this is. Yes, sir.
Understand. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for yielding. Mr. Chairman, I went to Mexico before you were born.
Yes, sir.
My parents and I went to Tijuana frequently when they were domestic servants in California. Since that time, I've been to that wall. I've also seen another prevarication from a presidential administration in the area of the Maquistadora. We were promised that things would be different during NAFTA, and that too was not truthful. You began your comments, Mr. Chairman, and I have great respect for your point of view. Yesterday, you heard my exposition, and I won't go back into it, in regards of what happened, particularly in Miami during the cocaine cowboy era.
Yes, sir.
I find it fascinating that we continue to talk about the southern part of our nation's border, and don't spend any time talking about the northern portion of our border. I have news for you. A lot of drugs come from Canada.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And a lot of potential terrorists come from Canada, with no reflection on the Canadian country anymore than with Mexico. But you began your comments saying that this wasn't the wall as we perceive it, it's a fence. Well, that's a pretty expensive fence, $1.6 billion or nearly that amount. And let's extract from the amendment that I'm supporting being made in order, Judge Carter's amendment. It provides $1,571,239,000 for the Department of Homeland Security to construct physical barriers, or he refers to it. In the language from the bill, Mr. Chairman, and I ask unanimous consent that this be made a part of the record.
Without objection.
The actual, and here's where you and I part company. You say if it had just been this $1.6 billion, it wouldn't have been like the Berlin Wall. You seem to ignore that this is the planning stages, and here is the language from the Carter measure, $38,239,000 for planning for border wall construction.
And as the gentleman knows, I did refer to that. That is the architectural study.
Okay, well, my point is, when we get through with that, experience teaches, at least if you all were to be in charge, that we are going to continue beyond this $1.6 billion, and you ignore the fact that the president lied when he said that Mexico would pay for it. But let me ask unanimous consent to insert into the record the statement of administration policy on what we're discussing.
Without objection.
All right? In that, in the second paragraph, mid-paragraph, it says, it protects us at home by providing for construction of the border wall. Nothing about no fence. And you and I know that if you get your nose under the tent, that it will cost us a good deal more on down the line. But what I'm more concerned with is the process and the fact that you are self-executing something into this particular measure that's going to put the members in a trick bag. And that's not right. And that's why I'm adamantly in favor of John Carter's amendment being made in order.
Mrs. Slaughter? And I
Thank you.
recognize the gentleman still has an amendment placed before the committee.
And I'd like to speak to that as
Yes,
well.
ma'am, further discussion.
I think we all know, and it's absolutely factual, that since the improvements we've done on the border, both electronically and with more agents, that we have had fewer people coming across the border than we have in decades, right?
In the last few months, we have seen a 70% reduction.
Which means to me that if we did more electronic surveillance there and perhaps more manpower, we wouldn't need to build a gigantic fence. But I think what I'm most disturbed about is this 1.6 billion, as I listen to you, is that's just the beginning. How many miles you say that was?
Well, it is here, I believe, 32 and 28.
So,
and
but
12.
this is supposed
32,
to
28,
go all the way to San Diego, right?
No, but we're talking about 60 miles out of 1,400
At
miles.
1.6 billion, so you're going to put the taxpayers in the hock here for the whole 20.
You know,
whole 20
this is
billion.
1.6 is what
But that's a
we're agreeing.
small part of it,
Well,
Mr.
but we
Chair.
have, but we don't even know what the plans are. And wouldn't it be nice to know what his plans are?
Not
if
costing
we're-
1.6 billion. Let me tell you, the state I come from, city of New York moves millions of people every week through tunnels and over track and everything. The governor was here this morning, and it's frightening what's happening up there. Penn Station is closed, 100-year-old equipment in there, 100 years old.
I've been there.
The way we have so totally neglected the infrastructure in this country is a shame. And it doesn't make any sense to anybody with a brain, I seriously mean this, that we would spend $20 billion on a fence or a wall, either one, when our infrastructure is literally falling apart and we won't put a dime in it. I think reasonable minds should ask themselves, what in the world do the Americans have in mind? They're barricading themselves inside a fence so that nobody can get to them, and they can't move around in their country because the bridges are falling down. The water supply, 100-year-old water systems in Rochester, New York. It just doesn't make sense, not to me. Particularly, as we both pointed out, there is such a great improvement in being able to stop people from coming in illegally because the improvements that we made, we put a lot of money in on that border. I'm glad we don't have to put a lot in on the northern border because Canadians are the best neighbors in the world. They bail us out more than the other way around. So. But let me yield back my time, but I just want to make that point of what I think. When I first got here, Mr. Whitten was in charge of appropriations. We had a dinner one night as a freshman, and he told me how he had built a Natchez Trail and recommended I do the same, that I'd ask him for a little bit of money for start of it. He had this great Mississippi accent, and then get a little bit of money for the end of it, and then there's no reason I wouldn't give you money for the rest of it. And I think that sort of sounds like what you're trying to do here, and we could spend up to $40 billion on a fence.
What we're trying to do is to appropriately work with the administration who identified what a bunch of darn Texans see as a major concern.
Why don't they see what the New Yorkers are going through as a major concern?
And
Isn't that a
what
concern if a bridge falls down there? If
just so you know,
if a
just so you
tunnel
know,
on the Hudson River, which is over 100
just so
years
you
old,
know,
yeah.
Texas is providing to the tune of about $15 million a year the backup on the river and along the border. Department of Public Safety of Texas is providing that out of their own pocket.
We send more money
Because
to
we-
Washington than we ever even begin to get back.
All I'm saying is, we did drop a couple pennies in that. And
Yeah.
It's a decision Texas made because of the dangerous
Well,
circumstances.
then, you know something? I think the people in New York, let me speak for them, and you speak for the people of Texas, and then let's vote on the floor and see who has most on both sides. I know you're self-executing this thing.
I am.
Because you don't believe that it would pass.
No, I got it in. We
Well,
got it in.
If you're not afraid of the vote, why would you
Well,
self-execute it?
Because like some things around here,
Because you can do it.
no, because we finally figured out where the president was on this, and it's taken months of.
What if he
negotiation.
changes his mind this morning?
If he changes his mind, it'll get to the Senate.
He's
they'll
been
be able
known to
make
do
that
that.
determination.
Mr. Chairman, just briefly.
Remembering, thank you very much, ma'am. Remembering that we are holding this as a
Amendment.
discussion pending the vote on Mr.
Just
Judge
briefly,
Hastings'
in
amendment.
support of Judge Hastings' amendment.
Yes, sir.
Just a couple of things. Looking at the amendment for Mr. Carter, there's money in here for planning, for fencing, and for construction of a wall. It's just, that's what it says. So, number one. The administration, in their statement of support, talks about how grateful the administration is for the committee's commitment to include the president's border wall proposal. So, but you mentioned darn Texans who are concerned about this wall. Let me refer to a fellow Texan, Representative Hurd, a former CIA officer, represents the largest border district in Texas, and he opposes this wall and the Carter Amendment. And yet he will not have a chance to be able to vote up or down on this. So going back to Ms. Slaughter's point about why this is being self-executed, I think it is being self-executed because the leadership in this House does not believe the votes exist, and that a number of Republicans would oppose this. This is a controversial issue. It is $1.6 billion, may not be a lot to the gentleman from Texas. It certainly is a lot to me and my constituents. And the idea that there will not be an up or down vote on this, that we're not even going to get necessarily a reflection of the will of the full House of Representatives, I think is unfortunate. So for those reasons, I would urge that we adopt Mr. Hastings' amendment and let the members, Democrats and Republicans, decide this. Let's not
That's
use
why we're
trickery,
here.
as Paul Ryan referred to, the self-executing process to try to get this into the bill. Thank you, gentlemen. I yield back my time.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Further discussion, the vote now be on the Hastings Amendment. Those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Noes have it, noes have it. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Burgess? Mr. Collins? No. Mr. Collins, no. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne, no. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Newhouse, no. Mr. Buck? Ms. Cheney? Ms. Cheney, no. Ms. Slaughter?
Aye.
Ms. Slaughter, aye. Mr. McGovern?
Aye.
Mr. McGovern, aye. Mr. Hastings? Aye. Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Polis? Aye. Mr. Polis, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman,
If
no.
the clerk could please advise the committee how the gentleman from Louisville, Texas, Dr. Michael Burgess, has voted.
Mr. Burgess is not recorded.
Could you please ask the gentleman how he would wish to be
Burgess?
recorded?
Mr. Burgess, no.
Thank you very much. If the clerk could please, excuse me, thank you very much. I'm not paying attention to this one right now.
Mr. Woodall?
Mr. Woodall?
Mr. Woodall, no.
Got moving parts around here. If the clerk could please provide the final tally.
4 yeas, 8 nays.
Thank you very much. The amendment is not agreed to. Not agreed to for amendment or discussion. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order and give the necessary waivers for the amendment number 96 to H.R. 3219, Division A, by Representative Lee, along with myself and Representatives Jones, Amash, Ellison, Welsh, Schiff, Sanford, and Hanabusa, which would prohibit funding for the 2001 AUMF 240 days after the enactment of this bill. And if I just may briefly say a few words in support of this amendment and why I'm doing it. In explaining why Ms. Lee's original bipartisan amendment was stripped from the bill, the majority has said it had a point of order against it. And as I pointed out, that the language you replaced Ms. Lee's amendment with also would have had a point of order against it if you didn't waive all points of order. But anyway, we're held to a different standard, and we have to jump through more hoops than the majority, and I get it. The way the system is, it's stacked against us. But Ms. Lee actually heeded your advice and fixed the issue and submitted this amendment. that is completely compliant with the rules of the House. Doesn't need a waiver to protect it. I mean, it's germane, and it fits all it addresses all the concerns that, that the majority had put forward. So I don't know what the excuse is for not making it order. Maybe, you know, my friends are afraid of having a debate and a vote on this, but I think under the circumstances, we ought to make it an order. I yield back.
Thank you, sir. Further discussion? Vote now be on the McGovern amendment. Those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. Noes have it,
That's
noes
for
have
roll
it.
call, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlemen, that's for roll call vote. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Collins? Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne, no. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Buck? Ms. Cheney? Ms. Cheney, no. Ms. Slaughter?
Aye.
Ms. Slaughter, aye. Mr. McGovern?
Aye.
Mr. McGovern, aye. Mr. Hastings? Aye. Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Polis? Aye. Mr. Polis, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk will report the total.
For yeas, 6 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to, not agreed to. Further amendment or discussion?
One final
Gentleman from
amendment,
Massachusetts.
Mr. Chairman, and that is similar to one I introduced.
Excuse me just a moment, please.
Mr. Chairman, just clarification on last one. I voted no on that amendment. And it may have just got mixed up with Mr. Byrne. I just want to clarify the record.
Excuse me. Excuse me just one moment. I'm not sitting here counting things out. Could the clerk please tell us how Mr. Collins was recorded?
Mr. Collins was not recorded.
Mr. Collins was not recorded. Mr. Collins?
Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins?
Wish to be recorded.
No.
Thank you very much. If the clerk could please provide the final tally.
4 yeas, 7 nays.
4 yeas, 7 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee strike the waiver of points of order against amendments made in order so that all member input is treated equally and fairly. And as I mentioned yesterday, you know, one of the concerns we have is that behind closed doors, the Speaker and the leadership stripped the Lee amendment from the bill without any debate or vote. This was an amendment that was openly debated in the Appropriations Committee and passed in a bipartisan voice vote. Chairman Sessions, in response, you said that one of the reasons you removed it was because it was legislating on an appropriations bill. But as I pointed out time and time again, that the amendment, an amendment by Mr. Griffith was made in order despite violating the rules. And I just, if you're going to waive the rules of the House for some proposals, mainly Republican ones, but hide behind those same rules for Democratic ideas you don't like, that sets an unreasonable double standard that we cannot accept. So striking waivers for the amendments will put everybody on the same playing field. And again, I think if you know, we're trying to encourage an atmosphere where there is mutual respect and more collegiality and more cooperation, I think the rules are important. And again, it appears to us that the deck is not only stacked against us, it is really stacked against us. And so I hope we can support my amendment.
Further discussion. Vote now be on the McGovern amendment. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. Noes have
As
it.
for roll call, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlemen, ask for roll call vote. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Woodall? No. Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Burgess? No. Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Collins? No. Mr. Collins, no. Mr. Byrne? No. Mr. Byrne, no. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Buck? Ms. Cheney? No. Ms. Cheney, no. Ms. Slaughter?
Aye.
Ms. Slaughter, aye. Mr. McGovern?
Aye.
Mr. McGovern, aye. Mr. Hastings? Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Polis? Aye. Mr. Polis, aye. Mr. Chairman? No. Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk will report the total.
4 yeas, 7 nays.
The amendment's not agreed to, not agreed to. Further amendment or discussion? Yes, sir. Gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order and give the necessary waivers for the amendment to H.R. 3219, Division A, by Representatives Peters, along with Representatives Kennedy, McEachin, O'Rourke, and Shank, Order number 148, prohibiting the use of funds to bar or restrict in any way the ability of transgender Americans from serving in the military. Let me speak to that.
Yes, sir. Gentleman's right.
So this is a late filed amendment, but I'm hoping, given the news of the last day, we can make it in order. I fully understand it's not in the chairman's mark because this was just submitted to the committee a few hours ago because, frankly, no one thought there'd be a need for it on the original deadline. So I think there's a good reason to be able to talk about that. It's a very short amendment, so it's just a couple lines. So I know it just got distributed. It wasn't given with the so I'd like to read it real quickly. It says, at the end of Division A, before the short title, insert the following. None of the funds made available by this act may be used to implement, enforce, or observe in any way any directive from the President of the United States that bars or restricts the ability of a person to serve in the armed forces because such person is transgender. So very straightforward amendment. As you know, and just apparently in a few short tweets, we're not sure the degree of consultation with the Defense Secretary or others. The President apparently said that about 15,000 members of our military will be kicked out, people that are playing important roles to fulfill missions that are critical for our national security. I think it's very important in the interest of national security that we include this language because the President is Commander-in-Chief. I don't think anybody doubts that, and we're worried that this irresponsible type of arbitrary action really puts a major burden on the military, particularly on the units and the fellow service members who depend on transgender Americans who fill particular roles in their units. As you know, there's somewhere between 10 and 15,000 soldiers who are transgender. They need to be focused on their missions, protecting their brothers and sisters in arms, doing what they can to defend our Constitution and our freedoms. Now we're not even sure, and their units aren't even sure, whether they're going to work the next day. Their commanding officer doesn't know if they'll be around in a week, in 3 weeks. Even today at the White House press briefing, Press Secretary Sarah Sanders said the White House has no plan to how to even implement this policy or move forward. So, it's a dangerous world. There's threats from terrorism. There's threats from North Korea. We cannot afford to weaken our military by kicking out high-performing service members just because of their gender identity. This is very different, Mr. Chairman, even from the discussions here about who pays for what. I mean, we've been having those discussions. They've got heated at times, but not even in any of the proposals brought forth by Representative Gomer or Representative Perry the other day did they ever say that transgender people shouldn't serve. They were talking about who pays for hormones and procedures, and it's an important discussion, and we had our feelings on that, but nobody was talking about saying that somehow they had to be removed from their combat roles and operations just because they're on hormone therapy. The discussion was who would pay for that. We all have our opinions. I had a disagreement, but it's a legitimate discussion. Who pays for it? Their service, having been trained, having been deployed, is critical for our national defense. So I think it's important given all that happened in the last 24 hours, to allow for this late amendment to be made in order. And I'll just close with a quote from Kristen Beck, a 20-year veteran of the Navy SEALs, who said, being transgender doesn't affect anybody else. If you can't defend that for everyone that's an American citizen, that's not right. Truly, our military is merit-based. There's a real preparedness issue if you suddenly remove 10 to 15,000 Americans, not to mention a future issue with recruitment in terms of transgender Americans not joining going forward. So for our all-volunteer military. So again, this amendment was late. I read it in its entirety. Very straightforward, very simple. I think it would pass the House, again, given that even Representative Gomer and Perry were not advocating for the removal of transgender troops. They were just talking about who paid for them. And I'd encourage its adoption of this amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Chairman, I want to rise in strong support of the amendment of Mr. Polis. I believe that America is strongest when those who love our country can serve. And, in all candor, and it's no secret to anyone here, I thought Donald Trump ran a very divisive campaign for presidency that appealed to the worst instincts in this country, to prejudices. And I had hoped that when he became president, that we would see a different person. But this announcement today shows me that nothing has changed. This is not only divisive, it is discriminatory, and it is bigoted. And I think under the circumstances, we ought to make this amendment in order, and I rise in strong support of the Polis amendment. I thank the gentleman.
Gentlewoman from New York.
I want to echo what Mr. McGovern said. Every day we think that we've reached a new low and we don't know how much worse it's going to get, and sure enough, it comes. But there's nothing in this but plain meanness. To choose people that you work with, that you serve with every day as being unfit, it's not a judgment that any of us are entitled to make, or we've been brought up to believe that we were not. And besides, the most important thing about people is their character. And we forget that at our peril. So I'm pleased that you brought that up, Jared, and support it wholeheartedly. I wish to goodness we could get that amendment out of this committee.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I echo the sentiments of Mr. McGovern, Mr. Polis, and the ranking member, Ms. Slaughter. The president references other presidents frequently. And in the last
He's better than
2 days, he said that Harry Truman was catching up with him. I have 3 uncles that served in military combat, 2 that received Purple Hearts in a segregated military. On a given day, Harry Truman determined that that was not in the best interest of this nation. And through his executive powers, he integrated the United States military that has been integrated in more ways than just African Americans and Latinos and Asians and people from the territories, but in a true sense of the word, a diverse military. I had the good fortune of being the classmate of Colin Powell's wife. And Colin Powell obviously was an exemplar of the apex of that achievement that was put forward by Harry Truman. I would that Donald John Trump would spend some time paying attention to these matters. As Mr. Polis points out, somewhere between 10 and 15,000 members of the United States military are transgender. All of them, like all of us, are God's children. And our failure to be supportive of their efforts serves again as a disservice to those of us in terms of our humanity toward each other. When I came here to Washington, I remember reading a newspaper that had a story in it and a cartoon that had 2 soldiers in a foxhole in Korea. And one of the cloud overheads said in a letter that he had just read that Negroes are moving into my neighborhood, our neighborhood. And he was writing back, and the other cloud said, a Negro just saved my life. Transgender people may very well, on any given day, be saving the lives of heterosexual people, gay and lesbian people, black, white, brown, and yellow people, all citizens of this country, all God's children. I yield back.
Yes, sir.
I am moved by, of course, what Mr. Hastings said. I would also point out that it was on this very day in 1948, July 26th, that Executive Order 9981 was issued by President Truman to integrate the military on this very day in 1948. And I yield back. I didn't know that either. It was a wonderful staff person that provided that to me. I don't have that date memorized. It was one of our wonderful Rules Committee staff members that handed that to me, and I yield back.
That's how far we go back, huh? We're falling down.
Thank you, sir. Is there further discussion? Vote now be on the Polis amendment. Those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Noes have it.
Roll call?
Gentleman asks for a roll call vote. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins, no. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne, no. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Buck? Ms. Cheney? Ms. Cheney, no. Ms. Slaughter?
Aye.
Ms. Slaughter, aye. Mr. McGovern? Aye. Mr. McGovern, aye. Mr. Hastings? Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Polis? Aye. Mr. Polis, aye. Mr. Chairman? No. Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk will report the total.
4 yeas, 6 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to, not agreed to. Further amendment or discussion. We'll now move, yes, ma'am.
No, I was just going to say there's not much else to say.
We will now defer to Mr. Cole for.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. I move that the suspension authority described in Section 5 of the rule be provided for the legislative days of July 27, 2017, and July 28, 2017. This would extend suspension authority to Thursday and Friday.
You've now heard the motion. Is the gentleman asking unanimous consent? I do. The gentleman's asking unanimous consent. Is there objection? So ordered.
I object.
Excuse me just a moment, please. The gentlewoman objects to the motion that has been made by the gentleman from Oklahoma. Is there a discussion?
No discussion. And not by me. You can have a discussion.
Interested in this discussion, but we were kind of catching up with you there. We started out 8-4, then 7-4, then
6-4.
6-4. How was that 6? I didn't count. Mr. Burgess is in the corner. Oh, okay. Stand corrected.
It wasn't me this time.
Yeah, so Woodall wasn't in the room. I would want to open it up so he could vote, but that's neither here nor there. All right, thank you for correcting me,
Yes,
Mr.
sir.
Chairman.
Yeah, no problem.
Mr. Chair?
I appreciate the gentleman. Yes, sir.
So we're seeking authority for suspensions on Thursday and Friday? Is that what we're seeking in this?
It would
So, yeah, and I think, again, I assume this will go through, but, we had a couple suspensions earlier in the week, and the problem that Democrats had with that, they failed, a couple suspensions that failed. The problem that Democrats had is it's unfair to Democrats and Republicans who are rank and file members of this body not to be able to amend bills. So, I mean, we had the intelligence authorization. I can never think that should be a bill that lots of members have priorities on. I've offered amendments in the past on that bill. My Republican colleagues have as well. And the suspension is a good mechanism for non-controversial bills, usually pretty simple bills that people don't object to. But we're a legislative body, right? So, I mean, we're going to bring back, I assume, the intelligence authorization and be able to amend that. But, having more controversial bills and extensions is not the answer. Again, I assume this will probably go through, but I just wanted to point out that suspension is not always the answer. And we don't want bills to bypass our committee, Mr. Chairman. I mean, we're a very important committee, and lots of members come here and have great ideas, and some have bad ideas too, but they're entitled to that because they're elected by 800,000 people, and they get to come here and amend bills as well, and I yield back.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. I would just add some bit of comment to this just from a perspective that I have. That is, on Monday nights when we come in, we use this first evening as an opportunity to handle Republican and Democrat and bipartisan agreements, things that Congress does need to vote on that are supposedly theoretically non-controversial, that have a threshold of 2/3, and it is my understanding that there is still room, because we're going to be here, to include more Democratic and more Republican ideas to this list. And it came as a request to us. Hey, we're going to be here. We'd like that opportunity. They've been vetted. They have been agreed to. As you know, there's an agreement on that. And so what happened is it was simply excluded from the original rule. Mr. Cole was asked by me if he would propose this amendment, offering the opportunity to add what we believe are 2 and 2 that would be cleared, vetted, understood from this process.
Will the gentleman yield for a moment?
I would.
And there's no problem in the world with that. That's the appropriate use of suspension. I think the Democratic leadership had clearly indicated that the intelligence authorization was not cleared by the Democrats. It was nevertheless put on the suspension calendar. Democrats were able to defeat it, along with one other bill. I believe it was a Veterans Choice Bill. So, you know, I would just encourage that, you know, Democratic leadership has consulted on these. I don't think there's a problem with these particular bills. There's not, from what I understand. But, you know, it just, I hope that in the future we can continue that active consultation with Democratic leadership.
Thank you very much. The gentlewoman asked the question, have they been consulted on these?
Right.
If so, if you'll give me just 1 second, I'll see what I can find out.
All right.
Thank you. There has been consultation, and it is my understanding that there are 2 and 2.
I know that our leader is very concerned about intelligence. She served on it for a number of years. And given the outright assault that our intelligence agencies have been under, the questions being asked about their ability to do their work and other things, it would seem to me that instead of
We'll do
putting
that
that on a
tomorrow.
suspension calendar.
We'll have that here tomorrow.
Well, but I'm really concerned about the way it was put together, no ability at all to amend or to change it.
An
So-
intelligence bill.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, I'm willing to.
I
I'm
don't
willing
feel it's
to hear-
intelligent to do it that way.
All right, so we will then move to the amendment that's offered by the gentleman from Oklahoma. Distinguished gentleman has brought the amendment. We've had a discussion. Those in favor of the Cole Amendment, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
The ayes have it, the ayes have it. And we will now move to the motion that the gentleman from Oklahoma, distinguished young gentleman, excuse me. Oh, excuse me. Mr. Woodall? Oh, you offered, you sure did. Thank you. Excuse me. The gentleman from Georgia offered the amendment, the motion. We'll now vote on that motion. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
The ayes have it.
Roll call?
Gentlewoman asked for a roll call vote. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall? Aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins? Aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne? Aye. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Buck? Ms. Cheney? Ms. Cheney? Aye. Ms. Slaughter?
No.
Ms. Slaughter? No. Mr. McGovern? No. Mr. McGovern? No. Mr. Hastings? No. Mr. Hastings? No. Mr. Polis? No. Mr. Polis? No. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman? Aye.
Clerk will report the total.
7 yeas, 4 nays.
The motion is agreed to. Accordingly, the gentleman from the state of Washington, Mr. Newhouse, will be handling this for Republicans,
And I will do it for the Democrats.
and Mrs. Slaughter, so that we cover just on the top line of H.R. 3219. This provides for 54 amendments, 21 Democrats, 16 Republicans, 17 bipartisan. I need to announce that the next meeting is scheduled for 2 o'clock tomorrow on the intelligence bill. 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock tomorrow, 2 o'clock p.m. And I thank you, and we have now completed our work for the day. Thank you.